Hey everybody, Jay Schlansky here from the Fifth Trooper Network. I just want to take a moment to thank you for checking out this show. Did you know that over at thefifthtrooper.com we have tons of other content, including blogs, other podcasts, all kinds of stuff. In addition, if you want access to exclusive content, you can join us on patreon.com/thefifthtrooper and join at any level and you'll get access to exclusive blog articles, access to our private Discord, and much more. So please check us out, and thank you so much for all your support.
Welcome to the Notorious Scoundrels, a Star Wars Legion podcast bringing you the latest news, general perspective, and competitive discussion.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome back to the Notorious Scoundrels podcast. I'm Kyle. I'm here with Mike.
Hey.
What's up?
Not much. T-minus 2 Notorious Scoundrels episodes until mini extravaganza. So
That's right.
that's what's up, Kyle. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. It's it's been a long, hot weekend.
I went to the pool today, so I'm feeling good. But
Okay, nice. Yeah,
Yeah.
we went to the pool yesterday and it was a nightmare. I mean, no, I'm joking a little bit. It was fine. The kids did not want to leave.
yeah.
Which is when you run into we were that family where I'm like physically picking up my children to drag them out of the pool.
Yeah. You have to physically remove them from the situation.
Yes.
Yeah. That's never fun.
No. So yeah, the pool itself was great. The kids love the pool.
But pool's great, but the kids.
Yeah, the leaving part is
Yeah.
not so great. But and we went to the beach and found a bunch of shark teeth. So there's that.
There you go.
But yeah, we're here to talk about Star Wars Legion, not
Really
the pool or the beach or how ridiculously hot it is.
Oh, it's not that hot.
Well, in air conditioning, it's fine.
Yeah.
I went for a run this morning early.
You went for a run in this? Dude, you're crazy. You're a crazy person. I don't know what you're doing here, man.
Got to be done, as the Australians say.
Yeah, I guess so.
And it's a lot less hot at 7 in the morning than it is at 1 in the afternoon. So still hot, but it's less hot.
Accurate statements.
Anyway, yeah, so Legion. So we're going to talk today about basically getting the most out of your games. We're probably going to be mostly focused on practice and tournament games because this is a competitive focused podcast, but we are going to talk also about basically like casual and learning games. I wrote an article on this on our site. So if you want a more in-depth, more or less in-depth, I guess we'll see, discussion on this.
A take
Please
that does
check it.
not include Mike's viewpoints.
There you go. Yes, that is accurate.
Yeah.
You can go read that article on our blog at thefifthtrooper.com/blog. But yeah, basically, so there's one notion I want to kind of dispel here first. And that is, I want to talk about competitive versus casual players. I feel like this is kind of a unhelpful binary distinction that gets applied to people. And it's like, for starters, involves a lot of inaccurate stereotypes.
Yes, it does.
But beyond that, in my experience, players kind of exist on a sliding scale. It's not just like one or the other. And even individual players can like, play any given game on the entire spectrum, right? Like I would say both of us, if we're anything, we're sweaty tryhards. If that's a thing, then that's what we are, probably, right?
Sure, if we're applying stereotypes
If we're applying stereotypes,
you shouldn't
that,
be applied, yes,
correct.
I suppose that's true.
Right. I don't think it is a thing, but if it were a thing, that would be us, right?
Sure. Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly.
Yeah. But, we also teach people the game. We play casual games where we're not looking to practice for a tournament or, be like super serious. we do alternate formats occasionally. So it's like, and similarly, players that mostly play in their garage at their basement or at the local game nut, sometimes they show up to local tournaments. So, and eventually sometimes dabble in like travel tournaments. I've played players at convention tournaments where they're like, hey, I got this game with my dad or whatever, and we've just been playing each other in our house this whole time, and we decided we'd come to a tournament and see what it's like. And it's like, hey, great, you know, glad you're here. So I prefer to talk about the type of game rather than putting players into buckets because, people exist on a diverse spectrum. And I don't find those stereotypes to be super helpful. So,
Okay. Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying mostly right now.
okay.
I think maybe when we get into talking about how you actually like interact with the games that you play while on that spectrum, I think maybe that conversation changes a little bit. But I think overall I'm with you.
Yeah. And I think it's important. One more thing that has, doesn't put players in categories, but puts the games in categories. Is it's important that you and your opponent are playing the same type of game. Obviously, if you're showing up to a tournament or something, it's going to be understood that you're both playing a tournament game, right? But if you're
Most of
like,
the
well,
time.
it should be, and if it's not, that's when you get problems, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Um, and the same is true of like a casual game night, right? Um, if you're if someone's showing up to like learn the game, they have no idea what they're doing, and another player is showing up to like practice for a tournament, and the two end up getting matched up against each other, you're gonna have problems because neither player is gonna get what they want out of that game, right? So, it's important that like you and your opponent are on the same page with the type of game that you want to play, basically.
That I agree with.
Okay.
It can get kind of sticky sometimes with like kind of like show up to the store nights
Yeah.
and sometimes like you're the only people that showed up or you're the only people that like paired up or like are left to pair off or whatever and you're looking for like separate things that can get sort of awkward I think sometimes
Yeah.
when we're talking about that. um
Well, let's talk about how to navigate that because that is the thing that happens, right?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that I mean if you're setting up if you got like a store night or whatever, we've definitely found that it's best to pair off in advance. Like we schedule our games ahead of time, like generally. Um and we try not to just like show up and hope someone is gonna be there.
Yep.
Um we did that for months and it just like didn't really work out. Um Because, I mean, like at the end of the day, like some people are showing up for super casual games and some people are not. And it can get frustrating and awkward if you kind of like burn 3 to 4 hours on a game that like neither of you are having fun playing.
Yeah, or you're not getting out of it what you want to be getting out of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's also just logistically, sometimes you get like five people show up and then somebody's left just kind of sitting around while the other four people play a game. So I would definitely advise, if you have like if there's like a local night on the schedule and it's just kind of a show up and play, please, I would encourage you to do that. But to the extent that you can create some kind of Discord community or Facebook Messenger community or something where you can post in advance to find games, that really helps to just really create visibility around the times that people are playing Legion at the store.
Yep.
But also it helps match people up with opponents that they're going to have a good experience with. So, um, before we get into these game types, I want to talk about two basic ground rules that I always think everybody should follow, regardless of what type of game you're playing. The first is simply don't be a douche,
Oh, okay.
right? Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think
You don't have to
I
be like
mean,
high fiving your opponent every time they
y-
get a good roll or something. But
yeah. I definitely think like don't be a douche is a good rule to live by. It can be hard sometimes. I will say that. Given I think personalities in Legion sometimes are tough to navigate, or any
Yeah.
war game, board game, whatever, at the end of the day, you got to spend 4 hours with the person across the table from you.
Hopefully
And
not quite that long, but yeah.
sure, 3 to 4, two
Yeah.
to 4 hours, right?
Yep.
So it's not like you're just like having like a 2 minute conversation with them
Right.
and then walking away, right? So um you do need to kind of develop a tolerance for maybe things that annoy you or frustrate you or rub you the wrong way that
Yes.
or would trigger you to be a douche. Right?
Yeah, because those things will happen to you at
Yes.
some point while you're
Um,
playing a game, and
and
you
I
need to be
would
prepared for that.
I would go as far to say that I think that like um you're probably going to run into like one of those people over the course of a tournament that is like 2 days,
On average.
probably on
Yeah,
average,
that sounds about right.
like one in six is like, not that they're like going to be hostile or whatever, but they're probably just going to rub you the wrong way, either because like, maybe they just got lucky and celebrated a little bit too much,
Yep.
or, I'm sure I'm guilty of that.
Oh,
But
I have my pet peeves. My biggest one is slow play.
me too. I'm not sure it's my biggest one, but it's very high on the list.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
do. That's like one of those things. It's like a developed thing. Like I don't think like early on in Legion, I think I felt a lot. I was a lot more tolerant of someone like thinking for like a few minutes about an action that was maybe perceived to be complicated. But at this point, like we've played Legion so much that it's like, yo, you chose to improv. That means you were looking for something. Did you get the thing you wanted? This choice shouldn't take more than like 10 seconds. Like you either got the thing you wanted or you didn't. Let's go.
Yep.
So
Yeah. So bottom line, you're gonna run into situations like that. You don't have to be like, again, you don't have to be like backslapping, hey, how you, but just be courteous and professional, right? So that's rule number one for me. Um, and the second is to just go into every game with some kind of objective about what you want to get out of it. Even if it's like I mean, and this seems like super basic, but even if it's like a learning or teaching game, your objective is to either A, learn the game, or B, teach someone the game, right?
yeah, yeah. I
I
mean,
know, I know that seems super simple to say, but I'd be surprised that, like, you'd be surprised how many people just kind of listlessly show up to a game night with their stuff, and they're like, "All right, let's play, sure, I guess."
I feel like this is the dad in you talking right now.
Yeah,
Because you're like I feel like we have very different viewpoints on this because I've got more free time than I can handle. And like
that's fair.
so when I show up to a game night, I'm like, yeah, let's do whatever. And I definitely don't have an objective every time I play. But I just like I know you well enough at this point that you're like very intentional about everything. So
Yep,
you're like, I'm playing a game. There must be a point to me playing this game outside of obviously the fun point, right?
yep.
So I'm not sure there necessarily has to be an objective, but I suppose it is a good practice to be in.
It yeah, it helps to make the most of your time, which again, to your point, if you have lots of free time, um, sure, I guess
Yeah.
maybe that's not as important to you, but I don't.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I've always been very objective oriented, like when I first got married, my wife, she loved to go on walks, which is great. Walking is really good for you, but she'd be like, "Let's go on a walk." And I'd be like, "All right, where are we going?" And she'd be like, "Around." Like,
yeah.
okay, we're not like walking to a store. We're not, you know,
Walking around the block.
yeah, like
Like,
where are we going?
yeah, yeah,
And what are we doing once we get there?
yeah.
Walking is a transportation. And now I've sort of embraced, just walking to walk because it's good
Embrace
for
the
you.
chaos. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And it gets the kids out of the house.
Mm.
Um, but like what, yeah. So I've always been sort of very like, everything has to have a point. But for me, at least, that's very true of Legion games in particular, just because, you know, my time is limited. So, and I know I'm not the only one in that position. So, yeah, have a goal, have an objective, know what you want to get out of a game. All right. So, uh, if you're playing so there's 4 different types of games, basically, in my view. There's
Jeez, I'm gonna have to pull up this article you wrote, Kyle.
in ascending levels of flightiness, you got learning/teaching games, you got casual games. See, this is objective oriented, right? This is an
Yeah,
objective oriented article.
absolutely.
Practice games and then tournament games. So we already talked about, for the teaching learning game, your objective is either to teach the game or to learn the game. There's a couple general things I want to hit on with this one and with casual games, and then we can move on to practice and tournament games, where I think we'll probably have more to talk about. And some of this should be super obvious, right? Like if you're teaching a game to somebody, then you should be talking through the stuff that you're doing and why, right?
Yes, 100%.
And you should be super forgiving of mistakes, right? Because a new player is totally going to make them. You should give them options if they want options for, like, well, you could do this or this, and this is why you might want to do this. And if they want to walk something back to, like, do something a little differently, then you should be totally fine with that. Also, I would probably avoid using the core set or / the learn to play stuff personally. So let me approach this from a different angle, and that's me learning another game. So I guess it's probably about a year ago now, maybe a little bit longer. I learned how to play Song of Ice and Fire, which is great, by the way. Super recommend. Very fun. It felt very Legion adjacent to me because it's alternating activations. And it's a similar scale in relative to, like, other rank and flank games. You're giving me a skeptical look here.
Yeah, those things you said may be true, I guess. They definitely were not true in my experience, but I've only played one game of it, so
Okay.
yeah. Anyways, continue. I'm interjecting and on a topic that is not really necessary to interject on.
Okay, fair. Sometime I would like to hear about your experience with that, because I quite enjoyed Song of Ice and Fire. But when I first learned the game, the guy teaching it to me, recognizing that I was an experienced wargamer, not necessarily with this game, but he was basically like, well, what do you want to play? What faction do you want to play? Do you have any, like, general, I'll make a list for you with my stuff, right? But do you have any general, like, things that you want to do or see? So without having played this game, I'm like, yeah, I want to play Night's Watch as the faction I chose. And can you make a list with, like, these things in it? Because these are the things these are characters that I like or whatever. So he did. And, when you're teaching someone a game, obviously you're going to be probably providing most of the components, but I think it's great in situations like that, particularly if the other player's, like, experienced in gaming, to offer them the opportunity to have some insight into what that experience is going to look like. Obviously, if this person is, like, just going in totally cold, then just set up everything for them and don't worry about it. But I really appreciated that going into it. And it was a great experience because it was tailored to what I wanted to get out of it, right?
Sensing a theme.
Yes. You got anything more to say about teaching / learning games?
I think I would agree with you on, like, do not use the learn to play and the core set. Like I would go a step beyond that. You should don't play 500 points, play an 800-point game.
Yep.
You just don't get the sense of playing Legion and understanding what it is. And I think I don't know if like letting them, like, construct their list is, like, super intrinsic to it, but I do think that I would make sure you, like, go over what all of the, like, components of the army are beforehand.
Yep.
And, like, explain to them what their purpose is. additionally, I would throw the turn 0 deck out the window and basically like just play like battle lines, clear conditions.
For a very first game. Yeah.
Like,
Just
you know,
pick the simplest setup that you can come up
yeah,
with,
like
basically.
intercept the transmissions or
Right.
something, you know.
Yep.
And kind of go from there. Just very cookie cutter. You know, the turn 0 stuff is like very advanced, I feel like, as far as like tools for playing the game. It's a thing that kind of exists outside of a game, really. So I would disregard those almost completely.
Yep. All right. Casual games. I don't know that I have much to say about this, except, as we already mentioned, make sure your opponent wants to do the same thing, and then you do you, right? I mean, mess around with something you don't normally play.
So I think I take issue with casual games, Kyle. I
As like a
with
general concept.
as a term,
Okay.
I
All
think, because
right.
I think we've got teaching casual practice and tournament, and I I would say that I don't know exactly how you defined a casual game here, but I would say that most of my casual games fall under learn to play or practice games.
Yeah, I think that's also true of me. I know that's not true of everybody though. Um, I think that's because, we tend to be practice oriented, right? Whereas like if I'm going to spend 3 hours doing something, I want to make sure that I'm working towards some kind of goal. Um, but I mean, there are a lot of players that have no tournament ambitions. They're just playing in their garage or their basement. I will say maybe casual is a little bit of a misleading term. I know that I talked about at the beginning of the podcast how I didn't want to do competitive versus casual.
Yeah. That's sort of where I'm like,
And
I don't.
because Legion is inherently a competitive game, right? You have somebody that wins and somebody that loses,
Yeah.
even if you're playing against your kid in your garage or whatever. Um, and there are definitely things like unit balance that affect players at all levels, including casual, right? You can have a negative play experience from.
Yeah, I know we were not going to talk about it at all, but clone commandos are a menace at all levels of play.
Yeah. Yeah. Players playing in their garage get frustrated by them just as much as tournament players do. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree that maybe this is not like, and this is a little bit of an ambiguous category because I know like there are games of Legion that occur that are not learning games, they're not practice games, and they're not tournament games, and you have to put them somewhere, right?
Sure. Yeah, I guess maybe this is more like uh fun games or something, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think I listed that as a good objective for casual games. You should always be looking to have fun for starters. Um, I I know you to have a different opinion on this one than I do.
Yeah, that's
But
fair.
fun is always an objective, even if I'm at the sweatiest of sweaty tournament games for me. I will also say, and actually this was one of the three basic rules. It was actually three rules in my article, not two, that I forgot, and that's you should always be looking to improve. Like you should always be looking to learn something, even if you're playing a casual game, or even if you're playing like a learning slash teaching game. I've done teaching games where the player that I'm teaching asks a question in some insightful way or something that makes me think about something differently. Um, but even in like even in a quote unquote, I guess we'll quote unquotes here to make this term a little more palatable. But even in a quote unquote casual game, you should be looking to improve or learn something, right? Uh,
Yeah. I mean, I
yeah.
would go as far to say like any game that I play in this quote unquote casual game territory,
Uh,
I definitely still play it like a tournament game.
yes.
As far as when I say that, my demeanor is certainly different, but
Your decisions are not.
my decision making at the table should not change. And if it does change, that is not good, not ideal, not what I'm looking to do. Like I'm never showing up to a game and being like, for good or for ill, even if I'm playing against a new player, like I'm not gonna take it easy on them. I'm gonna play my actions out on the table the way that I would in any other game, because that's how you develop bad habits if you choose not to do that. In my opinion.
Yeah,
But
that I definitely agree with. I don't really, I'm the same way. I don't really ever turn it down, so to speak.
yeah.
Like you can definitely bring a list that is, quote unquote less serious. Um,
Yeah, I put
but
Grogu on the board sometimes, but that doesn't mean I do stupid stuff with him, you know?
right. You're
You
still
know?
looking to, in any given moment, still make the best decision that you can make.
Yeah.
It's there's no it's not a reason to be sloppy. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and that's sort of, I guess, why I am having a little bit of a time with the like casual game
Okay.
aspect to it. Cause like
All right, let's call them for fun games,
for
for
fun
funsies.
games, even yeah. Anywho, I'm getting caught up on
Yeah.
putting things in buckets.
There's some, I mean, look, there's some loaded terms that we're using here.
There's definitely some
And
loaded terms.
unfortunately, I think this has kind of unfairly become like a charged conversation. And I've always resented the terms like competitive and casual and try hard and whatever other terms you want to use, um, for those reasons. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I think it's tough these days when it's clear that we're not the only ones that are using those terms to make
yeah,
decisions.
I know. I don't want to go there right now,
Yeah, that's fine.
though. um, okay. So how about we move on to practice games?
Okay.
Uh, so these are games where you're explicitly practicing for a tournament. You're trying some lists that you plan to bring to a tournament. You're trying some matchup that you expect to see. You're trying to just generally improve some skill or something, in anticipation of playing at a tournament. And it's should be understood between both you and your opponent that that's what you're doing. To the extent that like for practice games, I always like to ask my opponent like, what are you looking? Is there any particular matchup you want to try? What are you looking to get out of this game, basically? Um, because that really, I think more so than any of these other game types is a situation where, practice partner is a term for a reason, right? Partner implying that you're both sort of collaboratively approaching this in a way that helps each of you. And in order to do that, you need to know what the other person wants, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think understanding that from the get-go is a big deal. I think like 90% of my games that are not tournament games probably fall into this category. And I think when you're moving into a practice game or when you're going through it, I think it's good to be collaborative in that if something happens that is like kind of freakish, it's totally okay to wind it back.
Yes. So,
Um, yeah, yeah. Uh, and so like if a unit dies to like, I don't know, somebody rolls like 6 hits into your Anakin on turn 2 and you just go 0 for 6, right? And the game's just immediately over, basically. Like you could play it out and like don't get me wrong, there are things that you could maybe take away from playing that game out and how to like try to like come from behind game state, right? um but it's probably not actually going to be super helpful in for you in like understanding how the matchup in whatever fight you're actually working through is going to play out if your best piece is removed from the table for kind of as a freak roll of the dice, right?
yep.
um so I would say we roll stuff back all the time in our games, and I would encourage people that there's a couple things that I think are important there. A, you need to actually know what a freak freak thing is.
Right.
Because sometimes you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. And it turns out Bad Batch just rolls 9 hits every time. So like that's just gonna happen, so that's obviously an extreme of like something that is like that. But you know, you got to know your averages and you got to know your statistics and you got to know like what is reasonable or not reasonable to happen in certain scenarios. But if you have a good feel for that, I roll stuff back all the time is how I would recommend it for practice games.
How do you feel about rolling stuff back due to decision-making mistakes versus
We do
dice
that
luck?
all the time too.
Okay.
I in that we'll generally like play out the bad decision for like a turn.
Okay.
Or rather, what the way that I will do this, generally speaking, I'm not gonna say this too high up on my horse, but I am generally not the person that needs to roll roll things back. um, I generally will like give them like a turn before even having the conversation about rolling it back, and be like, and kind of like let a turn play out, and then after a turn goes by, be like, hey, we're in the middle of a practice game, like, do you understand the decision point that led you to where we're at right now? And if you don't, let's talk about it. And we talk about it, and then I'll be like, okay, you just want to like reset it, and like do you want to see what would have happened had you made the right decision, right?
Yep.
And sometimes it's not a turn, sometimes it's like a couple activations, because that's really all you need to like see the fallout of a bad decision.
Yep.
But it's a practice game, like resetting models and stuff, like you don't got to be like super exact unless
Yeah.
it's like a very hard sciencey, exact measurements super mattered in a given situation. But yeah, I do that all the time.
Now, do you think obviously being forgiving of mistakes and rewinding stuff is good for like maximum data collection, so to speak?
I've
Um,
I just want to take a step back. I've done it. I've allowed my opponents to do that in tournaments before. Um, I probably
rolling stuff back.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
like
So
several activations.
I want to talk about that when we get to tournament games
Yeah,
because I think this is an appropriate conversation to have for that setting as well.
yeah.
But at least for practice games, do you think that that builds bad habits if you're doing that in your practice games?
Um, can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Well, to the you're talking about an environment where obviously you're emphasizing learning, right?
Yeah,
Um, now, I like how you described it as like playing it out for a little bit to make sure that you kind of like reinforce why it was a mistake.
yeah. I
Um,
actually think that that's the most important part. If you don't do that, I I don't think it's worth rolling it back. I'm very much somebody that believes that people need to like see the fallout of their actions in order to actually
okay.
like
So maybe I just want to highlight that point, right?
yeah.
Because if you're immediately like, are you sure you want to do that? Because here's what's going to happen. And then they don't, maybe that doesn't quite burn that potential mistake into their brain as much as it would if you played it out for a few activations and then they lost the unit or whatever. And then you have that conversation where it's like, the reason this happened is because you did X. Uh,
Well, and I'd like to just give like a first world example of that
okay.
happened to me. At Worlds, it happened to me at Worlds 3 times. And I shouldn't say everybody, a few people that I knew kind of like behind the scenes were like, hey man, EXD is like pretty good, and I think it's gonna raffle stomp your list into the ground. And I was like, nah, it's fine. I've played against it a couple times. It's fine. And I hand waved it. I was just like, nah, it'll be good. And I didn't really take the time to play it out. And I didn't experience the fallout
Right.
of making the decision and having the bad thing happen to me. So I ignored it. And day 2 or whatever 3 of Worlds, I just went 0-3 against EXD and got basically tabled 3 times, right? So like, that, I mean, it happens to me.
Yep.
I don't know. So I mean, it can definitely happen to anybody, and I do think the fallout, experiencing the fallout, is super important. I mean, it's what is it? Negative feedback,
Yeah.
negative reinforcement,
Yep.
right?
Negative reinforcement. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you
Burning
shot
yourself on a stove.
that you don't do that again, at least for a
Right.
couple months.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yep.
yeah. So I guess to answer your question, I think it doesn't lead you to bad habits if you do it correctly, but you can't cut corners.
Yeah. You have to make sure that you actually walk it through.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about stuff like missed triggers and stuff like that? Also, totally cool with that in a practice game.
Um, I think uh
And maybe this is part of the building bad habits conversation as well. I don't know.
so I am of the opinion at this juncture that there should never be a mistrigger in a game ever. Um,
What do you mean by that?
what I mean by that is that if I the majority of the triggers in Legion, for the most part, are mandatory. There
Yeah.
are some optional ones. I almost always, as a rule, practice game or otherwise, remind my opponents of optional triggers. In any scenario that I remember the optional trigger, I will basically remind them if they don't say it. I think this falls in the don't be a douche category.
Yep. I agree.
Generally, I will say that if you're being a douche, that is the one time that I will not remind you of your triggers. If, if you were being a jerk, I am not going to remind you of your optional triggers. But if we're kosher, then yeah. I that's really all I have to say about that. I guess I think that you know
It doesn't matter what level. Triggers are triggers,
triggers
and
are
they should
triggers,
happen.
and like if um I mean, we can go to the very basic. You're not allowed to like miss a reliable trigger. You're not allowed to miss. I don't think independent is optional. Like there's
What about things? So I'm glad you brought up independent.
yep,
So example, Boba Fett has independent aim or dodge.
yes,
Uh, how do you resolve? And maybe we can move on to tournament games here.
yep.
Um, how do you resolve if you miss that trigger? Do you roll a dice and basically randomly assign a token? Do you let your
Um,
opponent choose if the game state hasn't advanced sufficiently that it doesn't, there's nothing about their decision making that would have changed?
yeah.
Uh,
I I feel this is a murky one, right?
I
Because
know
it's
that's why I'm
it's
asking
it's
about
it's
it.
both of your faults
Yep.
for starters.
Yep.
Because at the end of the day,
Game state
yes,
is everyone's responsibility.
game state is
Yep.
on everybody. Independence not optional. So I think if there is enough stuff, if it's like a very short time period and it didn't matter, just let them put whatever thing down. It's not that big a deal. But I do think that if you feel as the player that is across the table from them that them not having a specific token led you to make a specific decision. For instance, let's say that there was not a dodge token on Boba Fett, so you decided to shoot them with the intention of like following that shot up with another shot
Yep.
that maybe was only a couple dice, and you like that the secondary shot like wouldn't have done anything if there wasn't a dodge if there was a dodge token there. Like that's a pretty big decision point. So I think in those sorts of situations where it's actually impactful on choices that have been made uh, based on an incorrect game state. your opponent, it's a little bit of a negotiating thing, and that I would say that like your opponent kind of has to do what you say. It's a little weird, right? Like,
I mean, would you just call a judge in a
I
situation like that?
definitely would call a judge. I mean, but I think before we call the judge, the conversation would look something to the effect of, hey man, if you want to just put an aim token on that unit, you can have an aim token on that unit. Right.
Yep.
I feel a little bit weird about the dodge token. If you feel really set on trying wanting the dodge token, we need to call a judge to resolve this. Is how I would frame that conversation if I felt the dodge token was um basically advantaging my opponent based on the decisions that I had made, assuming that there wasn't a
Up to that
dodge
point,
token
right?
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the aim token's like a little bit weirder in this scenario because like you can't really make decisions based on your opponent having aim tokens, right? Like
Right.
that, like it doesn't really, the pool can still be what it was gonna be regardless of the aim
Right.
token.
Yeah.
Unless the unit has like lethal or something, but both the units that have lethal don't have independence. So anywho, so I would say like you can have a conversation as long as you're both happy with the outcome of resolving the game state. I don't really think you need to call a judge. But what I will say, don't let somebody bully you into resolving that game state error in such a way that you feel disadvantaged. If it, I mean, again, both players are like responsible for remembering triggers, but if it wasn't your unit, and that is more on them than it is on you at that
Yeah.
point.
You're definitely more responsible for remembering your own triggers than you are
Yes.
for remembering your opponent's triggers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The judge should obviously come over, figure out which token should go down, and then issue both players a warning in that scenario, in my opinion. Uh, but yes.
So I noticed none of the options you talked about, and I tend to agree with this, is deny your opponent the token entirely.
No, you definitely don't get that option.
Yeah.
Like it is a mandatory effect. Like um uh I definitely, this isn't Magic where like um I mean even Magic has like mandatory triggers, so maybe that's not a bad analogy. Or maybe that's a bad analogy. But like I think a lot of people just assume that triggers are optional. And that's like even, and that brings that like, oh no, you forgot you're reliable, like you can't put your search tokens down. you know um it gets a little bit more hairy with like aggressive tactics, right? Which I think
Aggressive
is
tactics is optional because it's like up to 4.
right. And
Yeah.
that this falls in the don't be a douche category, where it's
Right.
like, if your opponent, I think this is actually a great example, I think. So let's say you're playing anything other than droids.
Yep.
The chances they have more than 4 face ups are like
Small.
slim,
Yeah.
right? So just every one of their face ups gets a search token. Like, and you can let them, you can rewind that at any point, right? Like you're just being a jerk if you're like, if they get 2 activations and are like, oh, I forgot my aggressive tactics tokens, because it's like they only could go 3 places and
Right.
they
And
were
if they
going to
haven't
go
had
to
any
all 3.
opportunities to spend surges or whatever yet, then like who cares, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay. With droids, it gets a little bit weirder because there's options
Yep.
generally for where the search tokens go. Um, you know, uh, I think that falls in the kind of like independent aim dodge conversation category, in my opinion. Like, if you feel like your opponent is like choosing units that it is like with the now game state knowledge more beneficial to put the search tokens on, like I would be calling a judge at that point, right? um
Yeah. And typically, if I'm the one that forgot the tokens in a situation like that where I have options, I'll just be like, Look, what token do you want him to have, or
It-
which units do you want the tokens on? You know,
that's
uh,
really probably the best way to do it if you're the
yeah,
person that's kind of like in the wrong,
yeah,
right? Um, yeah. Uh, and obviously with aggressive tactics, I do think your opponent is like within their right to say you can't put surge tokens
sorry, yeah,
down, but again, don't be a douche. Like,
yeah. But I don't want to win that way.
right.
Personally.
Yeah, that's like not how your opponent played for the upgrade. Like, let them use the effect. So
There's a since we're talking about missed opportunities and triggers, there's a very famous example in 40K. 40K players will know what I'm talking about. This was at LVO, which is basically like their worlds, and I think it was like the semifinals. But basically, a player. So the way that 40K works is you have phases, right? Everything goes through a certain progression, and like once you've moved on to the next phase, you can't go back and do the previous one. Um, so there's an effect like infiltrating in 40K, which is deep striking,
yeah.
and basically that happens like at the end of all your movement. And in 40K, and I'm pretty sure, yeah, 40K is still like this, where you do everything and then your opponent does everything. It's not alternating activations. So you do like your entire movement phase. You move all your units, and then at the end of that phase, you do your deep strike units. So there was this tournament game where like one of the players was just nervous or excited, and he basically like he was thinking ahead to his deep strike units, so he put one down at the beginning of the movement phase, and his opponent even like helped him measure because they have to be as just like with infiltrate, they have to be like a certain distance from. It was clear that this dude was like thinking about deep striking. His opponent helped him measure. He put the unit on the table, and then his opponent was like, "All right, let's move on to the next phase." Before this guy moved any units, um, because that happens at the end of the phase, right? So like as soon as he placed that unit on the table, it was like boom, end of you've taken an end of movement phase action. Your movement phase is over. Um, and it was essentially like an auto loss, right? Because he just
You
missed an
skipped a turn.
entire movement. Yeah, he basically missed an entire turn. And like technically that's how it works in the rules, right? So the player that was like, all right, let's move on to the next phase, you're done. Um, like at least rules is written, that's how it works, right? But that's a clear situation where you should be like, you haven't moved anything yet. You sure you want to do that? Like, right? Like,
I've been told the guys have been making fun of me because they've been like picking up on my like cue words, and apparently my cue word for that, like, hey, you sure you want to do that, is interesting. And
yeah,
now they're saying it all the time, so it's
interesting.
making interesting. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you're about to make a bad decision, Mike says, interesting.
Interesting. uh, so
Meaning, I'm confused by what you're doing because it's suboptimal.
yes, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
I've shortened it to one word.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. So don't be that guy. It's the short version of this conversation.
yeah, I mean, in that example, I mean, that's very poor
It's the most
sportsmanship.
egregious example that
Yeah,
I can think of a missed trigger enforcement. And that whole thing blew up in such a way that it involved like the creator of Riot Games donating to charity, and like I mean, it's a whole separate story that I won't get into here because this is not a 40K podcast. But needless to say, that it was a big deal when that happened.
I'm sure it was. I hope
Uh,
that guy got a ton of crap because the person that was being a douche, uh, you
yes,
know,
well, he did win that game, but then in the very next game, again, right, like you said earlier, if your opponent's being a jerk, you're not going to give them this kind of leeway.
yeah.
He fell victim to something very similar in what turned I think was the final, and his opponent was like, "No,
Yeah, yeah. Sorry,
yeah,
man.
sorry, no backsies. Let's move on."
Like
Um,
you've decided it's one of those things where you sort of I don't playing to their level is not quite the term I would
yeah,
use, but sometimes you do have to play by their rules. In order to maybe teach a lesson, right?
yeah.
Um,
All right, let's talk. We kind of skipped over the initial part of what we've been doing with each of these sections, which is talking about like objectives or what you want to get out of a given game. So what are you looking to get out of a tournament game?
A tournament game or a practice game?
Tournament game.
Tournament game. Well, I mean, I'm looking to win.
Yeah.
Frankly, I would say that if you had asked me this 3 years ago, it would be to like just have a good game.
Also fair.
But I think at this juncture, um, I'm just looking to win when it comes to tournament games, and frankly, good games will come as a result of that
Yeah.
most of the time. I don't want to have a good game because I made a bunch of mistakes, right? Like,
You
that
want to have a
definitely.
good game because you played, you know, to your maximum potential, and your opponent also played to their maximum potential, basically.
Yeah, so I guess maybe what I really mean here by winning is I would like to play a perfect game.
Okay. Yeah.
Is the objective. Um, in that if I could go back and play the game again, I would not make any choices differently. After like kind of doing the after action replay it, via stream or just in my head or whatever. I mean, I will say, I go back any games that I have on stream at this point, I definitely go back and I watch them all.
Yep. Same.
Because I it's weird as we get older. I'm not sure if it's because we're getting older or if it's because it's always been like this and we just have more things that we remember. But it's becoming clear to me that like things just don't actually happen the way that you remember them most of the time. And it's just like so when you kind of go back and replay games, and this is more of like a life thing than a Legion thing,
Yep.
honestly, but it does obviously pertain to Legion. Um, Oftentimes, like what you think was the case is not 100% the case most of the time. Whether that be with like, you know, maybe you did the math wrong on like figuring out the victory points like midway turn 3 and you like did the calculus a little bit wrong and so that led you to like move a unit too far one way or the other, which skews the rest of the game.
Well, and for me, it's the way that your brain stores things in real time is different than usually, at least in often important and subtle ways, than different than what actually happened. Like in the moment of a game, something bad might happen to you, and you're like, man, my dice, right? That was really terrible. And then you go back and you watch the game, and you're like, oh, I could have just like not put that unit there.
Could just not got
And
shot, right?
right.
Yeah, yeah.
I could have done this other thing instead, and then I wouldn't have had to even make that roll. But you don't realize that in the moment. And you may not realize that in your after action report either. Um, but one of the things too you can do, and this is true of any game, right? Not necessarily tournament games, but if you have time, obviously in a tournament game, I like to have like a conversation afterwards with my opponent where it's like, okay, what mistakes did I make? How'd you feel about that game? And basically talk through it, because that's a situation where, not every game is streamed, obviously. You don't always have that luxury. So in a situation like the one I just described, maybe your opponent is like, well, on turn 3, when you unnecessarily expose that unit of clone troopers, like I remember you complaining about the dice, but A, that was a BX droid shot, so that's like what happens. And B, you could have just gone with this other unit instead, and then I wouldn't have been able to shoot them. Um, and that's something that if a game's not streamed, you might not pick up on that if you don't actually ask your opponent, like, tell me about some stuff that I could have done better, basically. So yeah, and I think it's totally fair to have that conversation in a way that's like professional and not douchey.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. A lot of this is like you kind of got to read the atmosphere at the table,
Yeah.
right? Like, particularly with tournament games, I think it's easier to do that earlier in a tournament.
Yes.
Just because there's relatively lower stakes. When you start getting
It's
into
not
like,
it's not as raw.
it's not as raw, right? Like when you get into like a top 8 cut at like Nova or Adepticon or LVO, right? those games start to feel like they matter a lot more quickly.
Yeah,
And I would say that like if you're on stream, I generally think that that also kind of like amplifies it. Um,
it does. Yeah.
people are watching.
Yep.
I definitely um like taking our like the LVO finals from last year where we played each other.
Yeah.
Uh like it was relatively low stakes given the circumstances. And that
Yeah.
like you already had a flight and stuff. So we were like, we weren't really playing for money, but like
We were playing for pride, and that
we
was
were
it.
playing for pride.
Yep.
And like there was also like 20 people that like just like brought chairs and like circled the table, right? Um and we were on clocks, right? Like
Which
that
was really relaxing, honestly,
I,
in my
maybe
opinion.
for you.
Yeah, it was relaxing for me.
As the aggressor, I could see how that could maybe relax you in that situation, but I needed every ounce of time I had that game. Um, I got
Uh,
shot off the table anyway, so it didn't matter.
yeah, it had, quick tangent.
Yeah,
Blocks for me, the reason that they're relaxing has nothing to do with the list that I am playing, and
yeah.
everything to do with I don't have to think at all about how long my opponent is taking. I'm completely responsible for my own destiny when it comes to time.
I'm with you. I think it was just like the first actual
Yeah,
real life experience where we had used clocks that wasn't like on TTS. So
yeah,
it
that's
was like
fair.
one of those, it was like, we're in the finals of like a really important tournament and
Yep.
we've never done this before, right? Like, so it's kind of just like the one thing added in. Um,
Yeah, that's
anyways,
fair.
my point being that like that was still a pretty stressful game, and I would say both of my games that were before that were also stressful.
Hmm.
My game with Timbo directly the game before was like, I would say, was probably one of my most stressful games ever, particularly because like 3 activations before the game was over, I was 100% sure I was going to lose. Um, because like the play was sort of face up on the table and he just like didn't find it, which obviously was good for me.
Yep.
Um, but I definitely thought I was completely dead. And in those circumstances, you're like, okay, the game is over, right? You just won. You shouldn't have. Like, do you have this conversation with your opponent that's like, let's talk about the missteps that we both made? Where the misstep that he just made was like punting the game, like, he was on like a 25-yard line with a like just like easy chip in field goal for the win, and he punted it out of bounds, like um
Yeah, I
and I
think
can
you
say this because we've had this conversation many
yeah,
times at
yeah,
this
yeah.
point.
Right.
But you know like we definitely didn't talk about it right then and there. Right,
Yeah,
like,
and in that situation, it's not appropriate for you to bring it up unless they do first.
right,
And
and
yeah,
even then, uh, in a situation like that, like it was pretty raw at that juncture,
yeah. So maybe you just
like
be like, I don't know, man.
good,
We'll
it
have to
was a
go
good
back, and
game,
it was
man.
a good game. We'll have to go
Go
back and
back
look
and
at it. Yeah,
yeah, and it's just and unless it's like your buddy, I and even then, like, uh, you're gonna know your buddies well enough to know whether or not like that is a good thing to do or not to do at the end of a game. I definitely have friends where like I would not do that. It's like, we'll talk about this 48 hours later, and once you've had chance to
yeah.
cool your jets about how this game went, right?
I've learned that the hard way, and there have been a couple of games where I haven't been involved, and I've just been watching, and my friend has lost and been like, "Hey, so what do you think I could have done differently?" And I've like answered them honestly, and I've immediately been like, "Oh, I want to put those words back."
Yeah.
Um,
It's like
I need to wait a couple days to say this because then yeah. So you got to read the moment, and I definitely have not been good at reading that moment, and in some past situations, and I apologize for this. But
I mean,
yeah,
you do have to be careful because I think a lot of times when people have those conversations, they're actually looking for validation that it wasn't their
yes,
fault.
100%.
Right. They're looking for validation that there was nothing that they could actually do to affect the outcome. They're looking for you to say, "Nah, man, like I'm not really sure what you could have done." Like,
Yeah, and
You
instead
know,
if your answer is like, well, actually, if you'd done this, you definitely would have guaranteed one.
right.
And like,
Like that's not really what they want to
no,
hear
definitely
at
not.
that specific juncture.
No, yeah. So, uh, yeah, we,
Again, this is a very good life lesson for everybody in the room, just
mhm.
generally. This does not apply to just Legion.
It does not. Yeah,
Like
read the room.
this is a good thing to know if you like manage people in any way, shape, or form.
All right. Well, any other considerations with respect to getting the most out of tournament games or any
um,
games generally?
I think I know that like I've said this before, I'm sure you said this a ton too. I think collaborative tournament games and just any games in general are best. And by collaborative, I mean more than two people. I mean, there are maybe two people playing the game,
Yep.
but there are 1 to 4 bystanders that are watching the game and either interjecting with advice or whatever. Obviously, not in a tournament game. Don't
Yeah.
give advice to people. You're not allowed to talk to them.
Yep.
Um, Even if you say a game state error, don't do
No,
anything. Like
just keep
that's
your
not
mouth
on
shut.
you.
Yeah. Right.
Um, you know, um, but outside of tournament games, like it's okay to watch the tournament games and then talk about them after.
Okay.
But outside of that, I think interjecting in like practice games and stuff is actually super helpful. And I think actually leads to kind of like those situations where, you're like, okay, this is what I would do here. This is what I think is most optimal. And you've got somewhere between 3 and 6 people that are all kind of like, well, is it actually right? Like, given the game state on the table, do we as a group find consensus in you playing command card X and then immediately activating this unit is the best thing that you could be doing right now?
Yep.
And I find that like,
Sorry, let me interject real quick.
yeah, go for it.
You want to make sure you're talking about a practice environment where like everybody there is involved in this practice outcome. You're not talking about like walking up to some random person's table and
Yes.
watching and being like, "Hey, maybe you should consider doing this instead."
Yeah, no, no, no,
Yeah,
no.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm definitely like everybody is sitting there invested, and I know that like some of the times the guys at the store get annoyed because I will actually just go to the store and watch games
Mhm.
instead and like just sit there interjecting all the time.
Yep.
Um,
But these are guys you know in your local practice group that
these
you
are
have good
these
rapport with,
yes,
not random
100%.
strangers. Yep.
And most of the time, they're like, oh yeah, you know what, you're right. That can make my play better, right?
Yep.
Sometimes they're like, go away, Mike.
Yep.
But I do think that I find that it helps. It's definitely opened my eyes to things that like I wouldn't normally see, and it's just it's a way to quickly challenge your assumptions without having to identify them beforehand. It
Hmm.
is to like what assumptions actually need to be challenged, right? They're immediately challenged as they happen.
Yep.
um and obviously that leads to games taking longer, but and obviously if you're going to do something like that, you want to be of relatively equal skill, I would suggest. Or I mean, that's not to say that like having someone that's got significantly less skill is a bad thing, but you don't want to have like several players with significantly less skill at the table. Like if you've got like one or two, if you've got 6 people and like 1 or 2 are like kind of down and the other 4 are like relatively equal, you'll bring the other 2 people up as like kind of osmosis as you
Yep.
continue going through that process, right? Um, but everybody gets better in those situations because
Yep.
those conversations are just good to have.
Yeah, I guess the takeaway there is making sure that you approach practice in an extremely community focused and collaborative way.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the best way to do it. I think it definitely escalates learning how to play the game um well, um, in, in a much more rapid pace. But um like I would say I have learned more about Legion in the last year and a half than I have in the previous 4 years.
and that's just because we've been able to do this on a consistent basis, like every Thursday.
Yeah.
And yeah. So
Awesome.
that's I guess what I have to say about that.
And that's all I have to say about that. Let's name that movie. Forrest Gump.
I actually have no idea. Okay, Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump. Yep. And that's
Yeah.
all I have to say about that. All right. Well, we've got, I guess at this point now, T-1 more episode until mini straff. So
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it. I think we got away mostly with not talking about clone commandos and experimental droids.
they were
today.
briefly mentioned. But
They were briefly mentioned. I like to, I do want to bring something up here before we kind of wrap this situation. I've seen some complaints running around that we only talk about Republic on this podcast. And I just want people to know that if your factions were good, we'd talk about it.
Well, I think I saw somebody say, well, it's too bad they only play Republic. For starters, I'm an experimental droids player. Please, let's not judge. No, but seriously, we actually play and have played over the course of the game all of the factions.
Yeah,
I have a ginormous Rebel and Empire collection that I'm just dying to use.
Me too, frankly.
But yeah, but yeah, I'm painting my droids right now. Look, here's a BX droid right here that I'm midway through on. I finally found. I made the mistake of painting just the strike teams when they first came out.
Yeah, I stopped doing that.
I learned the hard way.
Yeah, I'm at this. I originally just painted I went a step further and just painted the heavy weapon that went in all of the units too. So I've got units that are painted that were the heavy weapon options that are now good that weren't at the time. I don't have painted.
Yeah, because that basically what I found is that the way that I remembered painting them was not correct. Because I went through and I took myself through most of the process and I'm like, these don't look the same. I don't know if I didn't use the same colors, if I did it in a different order or something. But anyway, I think I finally figured it out, but it took me 3 tries. And since I use an airbrush, that's 3 tries times, whatever that is, 15 models.
Yeah.
So yeah, don't make the same mistake as me. Just paint the whole unit at once, even if it's not good.
That's definitely the way to do it. I just paint an entire box at once at this point and move on.
Yep.
Because who knows when you're going to need those other models.
Yeah.
It's one of the things Jay used to live and die by, that whole just paint the whole box, man. Just do it. And I was like, nah, man, you don't need them. The HH12 is never going to be good. You're never going to use that thing. And that now it's 16 points, right? So it's yeah, I could see taking it, I guess.
Yeah, and it'd be one thing if you could just go back and perfectly replicate the method, but I've found that I can't do that consistently, and then they look different, and it drives me insane.
Well, and the issue that I run into is I don't paint a lot, which by extension means I'm not really able to replicate things because that's just not really a thing, and B, it also means that because I'm really bad at painting, I tend to make significant improvements
over time.
Just learning one new skill is a pretty big significant increase in how things look on the table. So and it's tough to go backwards. It's tough to paint things that look the same as when you were a worse painter, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's not like you're going to go back and repaint your other stuff that you previously painted that looks slightly worse.
Yeah, no, definitely not. Right. I don't have the bandwidth to paint the unpainted stuff I have, let alone
repaint the stuff you've painted already.
You crazy?
Yeah. That's what I mean. Yeah. All right. Well, unexpected hobby tip in this episode. Paint the whole box.
Paint the whole box.
At the same time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are the Notorious Scoundrels. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Mike.
Stay fresh, cheese bags.